Have you ever wondered what hides in Pennsylvania's forgotten towns? Welcome to Black Fears. Tonight, 8 true stories. Names changed for privacy, but every detail 100% real. Abandoned factories that breathe, watchers in the woods, pasts that refuse to die. Drop your location and when it happened in the comments. Subscribe now, because what we uncovered will terrify you. Let's begin. My name is Xavier, and I'm 29 years old. Back in October 2018, I worked as an industrial salvage contractor in Washington County, Pennsylvania. My job was pretty straightforward. I'd go into condemned buildings, assess what scrap metal could be recovered, document everything with my camera, and submit reports to salvage companies who'd buy the rights. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well, and I didn't mind spending time alone in abandoned places. That mindset changed completely after what happened at the old zinc smelting plant in Denora. Denora's a small town, population maybe around 5,000, sitting right on the Monongahela River. Most people who know anything about it remember the 1948 smog disaster. 20 people died when industrial pollution created this toxic cloud that just hung over the town for days. The zinc plant on McKean Avenue was one of the main culprits, and it had been sitting abandoned since the 70s, just this massive, rusting skeleton of Pennsylvania's industrial past. The building was finally scheduled for demolition, but before they could tear it down, my company got contracted to see if there was anything worth salvaging. I arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of October day where the cold feels damp and gets into your bones. The plant loomed against the sky, all broken windows and corroded metal siding. I pulled on my respirator, standard procedure for any site this old, grabbed my camera and clipboard, and headed inside through a side entrance where the padlock had already been cut by the demo crew. The moment I stepped through that doorway, I noticed the smell. Even through my respirator's filters, I could detect this heavy metallic tang in the air, like pennies, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic. The interior was exactly what I expected. Collapsed ceiling tiles, debris scattered everywhere, old machinery covered in decades of grime and rust. I started in the main production floor, photographing equipment that might contain recoverable copper or steel. The place was silent except for my footsteps echoing off concrete and the occasional creak of settling metal. I'd been working maybe 45 minutes when I moved into the old smelting chamber, this massive room where they'd actually processed the zinc ore. That's where I first noticed something wrong with the walls. At first, I thought it was just an unusual corrosion pattern. The walls had this texture that looked almost biological, irregular bumps and discolorations that reminded me of skin. I moved closer, raising my camera to document it, and that's when I saw what looked like pores. Actual pores, the kind you'd see on human skin, scattered across the surface of the wall. Some areas had this mottled appearance, like liver spots or bruising. Other sections looked smooth, almost waxy, and in one spot, I swear the surface had goose flesh, these tiny raised bumps like when you get cold. I lowered my camera, my heart starting to beat faster. This had to be some kind of mineral deposit, maybe something to do with the zinc processing. I'd seen weird things in old factories before, strange chemical reactions that created unexpected textures and colors, but this looked so much like skin that my brain kept insisting that's what it was, even though I knew that was impossible. The metallic taste in my mouth got stronger, and I realized I was breathing harder, my respirator's filters working overtime. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out, but I had a job to do, and I've never been the type to let irrational fear control me. So I did something incredibly stupid. I reached out and touched the wall. It was warm. Not just warm from some ambient heat source. It was body temperature warm, maybe 98 degrees. And the texture, God, the texture felt wrong. Slightly moist, with a give to it that concrete or metal should never have. I jerked my hand back, and as I did, I felt something. A pulse. A definite rhythmic throb beneath the surface, like a heartbeat deep inside the wall. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a piece of fallen machinery. My hand was shaking as I looked at it, and I saw this dark, oily residue on my fingers where I'd touched the wall. It was warm too, almost hot, and it was starting to make my skin sting. I wiped it frantically on my jeans, backing toward the doorway, when I heard the sound. Breathing. Wet, labored breathing, echoing through the smelting chamber. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the building itself was drawing air in and out of a massive, unseen lungs. The sound had this horrible rhythm to it, a raspy inhale that seemed to pull at the air around me, then a shuddering exhale that smelled like decay and chemicals mixed together. I ran, not walked quickly, not hurried. I ran straight for the entrance I'd come through, my boots pounding on the concrete floor. But I'd gotten turned around somehow in my panic, and instead of finding the main production floor, I ended up in a narrow corridor I didn't remember seeing before. The walls here had that same skin-like texture, but worse. They looked inflamed, reddish, with dark fluid seeping from cracks in the surface. The breathing sound was louder here, and the corridor was actually moving, the walls contracting and expanding in time with those horrible wet breaths. I pressed myself against one wall to squeeze past a fallen beam, and the moment my shoulder made contact, I felt the wall respond. It was warm and damp, and beneath my touch, it contracted, like a muscle flinching away, or toward. I couldn't tell which, and I didn't want to know. The dark fluid was flowing more freely now, running down the walls in thick rivulets that pooled on the floor. Where it touched my boots, it sizzled faintly, and I could smell burning rubber. The corridor started getting narrower. I'm not even sure if it was actually physically closing in or if I was losing my mind, but the walls seemed to be swelling, bulging inward, reducing the space I had to move through. The breathing got faster, more urgent, and I could feel the air pressure changing with each respiration. On the exhale, the corridor would expand slightly and push humid, rotten air into my face. On the inhale, everything would contract, and I'd feel this suction, like the building was trying to pull me into itself. I saw something ahead that made my stomach drop, pustule-like growths, dozens of them, clustered on the walls like grotesque bubbles. They were translucent, and I could see dark shapes moving inside them, suspended in some kind of fluid. As I got closer, I realized with dawning horror that the shapes looked like faces. Distorted, melted faces pressed against the membrane of each pustule, mouths open in silent screams. One of them ruptured as I passed, spraying me with thick, acrid liquid that burned through my shirt instantly. The pain was incredible, like being splashed with acid, and I screamed, clawing at my clothes. The gas that escaped from the pustule was noxious, overwhelming my respirator, and suddenly I could taste everything, metal and rot, and something sweet and terrible that made me gag. Through my watering eyes, I saw a shaft of daylight, a ventilation shaft, maybe 3 feet wide, its cover long since rusted away. I didn't think, didn't plan. I just dove for it, squeezing into the narrow space and scrambling upward. The metal was hot under my hands, and I could hear something below me. A wet sliding sound, like something huge was moving through the corridor. The breathing was right behind me, so close I could feel moisture on my legs. I climbed faster than I've ever moved in my life, my shoulders scraping against the shaft walls, my lungs burning. My hands were blistering where the oily residue had soaked through my gloves, but I didn't stop. I could see the opening above me, could see gray October sky, and I pulled myself toward it with everything I had. When I finally burst out onto the roof of the plant, I collapsed on the corroded metal, gasping and shaking. My clothes were smoking where that fluid had hit them, and my exposed skin was covered in angry red welts. I could still smell it, that horrible sweet rot smell, and taste the metallic tang in my mouth. I crawled to the edge of the roof, found an external fire escape, and made my way down. I drove straight to the hospital, barely coherent, trying to explain what happened. They treated the chemical burns on my hands and chest, asked me questions. I couldn't really answer. I told them I'd been exposed to something in the old plant, and they did blood work, kept me overnight for observation. The burns healed slowly, leaving scars I still have today, patches of discolored skin on my palms and across my collarbone that sometimes still sting, especially when it's cold. I submitted my report to the salvage company, kept it vague, just said the site was too hazardous to recommend any salvage operations. The demolition moved forward as planned. 3 weeks later, the plant came down, and I watched the news coverage from my apartment, drinking too much and trying not to think about what I'd experienced. But I heard things, bits of information that filtered back through the demolition crew. They found organic material, they said, tissue, fused somehow to the metal and concrete infrastructure. The site supervisor told me over beers one night that it was the damnedest thing he'd ever seen, like the building had been growing something for decades. They sent samples to some university lab, but he never heard back about the results. The whole thing got quietly swept under bureaucratic rugs. The worst part came near the end of the demolition. The crew foreman, a guy named Rick, who'd been in the business 30 years, disappeared. One day he was there, the next he was just gone. His last radio transmission, according to the equipment operator who heard it, was confused and panicked. Rick had been saying something about the walls, about them bleeding, and then the transmission cut out. They found his hard hat near what used to be the smelting chamber, but nothing else. The official report said he probably wandered off the site, maybe had a medical episode. They searched for a week, found nothing. I don't do industrial salvage anymore. I couldn't go into another abandoned building after that. Couldn't trust that the walls were just walls. I moved into property assessment, work that keeps me in offices and occupied buildings. I see a therapist every month, and we talk about what happened, though I've never told her the full truth. How could I? How do you explain that a building was alive, that it had absorbed the people who died there 70 years ago and had been slowly digesting them, becoming them, until the walls themselves were made of human tissue and industrial waste fused into something that shouldn't exist? Sometimes I wake up at night and I can still feel it, that pulse under my fingertips, the warmth of skin walls, the wet breathing echoing in my ears. My hands will be burning with phantom pain, and I'll have to get up, turn on all the lights, touch the cool, normal, definitely not alive walls of my apartment, just to convince myself that I'm safe, that buildings don't breathe, that what I experienced in Denora was some kind of hallucination brought on by chemical exposure. But I know better. I know what I felt, what I saw, what I barely escaped from. And I know that somewhere in Denora, where that plant used to stand, there's still something in the ground, waiting. Because you can't kill something like that just by knocking down the walls. Whatever was in that building, whatever those people became in 1948, it's still there, buried under rubble and new construction, breathing slow and patient in the dark, getting ready for the next time someone disturbs it. The scars on my hands throb sometimes, especially in October, when the weather turns cold and damp. And when they do, I can taste metal in my mouth, and I remember the sound of breathing walls. My name is Solana, and I work as a late-night radio DJ at WCQB, a small AM station in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. Wellsboro's this charming little town in Tioga County, maybe 3,000 people, known for its Victorian storefronts and these beautiful gas lamps that line Main Street. I'd been doing the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., for about 3 years when this happened, back in March 2015. I loved those quiet hours, playing oldies for insomniacs and truckers passing through on Route 6, taking the occasional call-in request. It was peaceful work, and I felt safe in that little studio with its soundproofed walls and warm lighting. That sense of safety disappeared completely on the night of March 14th. The shift started normally. I'd queued up my playlist, done the station identification, settled into my chair with coffee and the mystery novel I was reading between segments. Through the studio window, I could see Main Street below, empty except for the occasional car, the gas lamps casting these pools of golden light on the sidewalk. It was one of those late winter nights where everything feels suspended, frozen, waiting for spring that's still weeks away. Around midnight, I took a call from a trucker heading east, requested some Johnny Cash, and we chatted briefly about road conditions. After I hung up, I noticed the signal strength meter flickering. That wasn't unusual. Our equipment was old, and sometimes we'd get interference from other stations, especially late at night when atmospheric conditions changed. I adjusted a few dials, got everything stable again, and introduced the next song. At 12:47 a.m. exactly, I remember, because I glanced at the clock when it happened, my broadcast cut out, just died mid-song, replaced by static. I swore under my breath, reached for the controls, but before I could touch anything, another signal came through, clear as day, pushing right through our frequency like we weren't even there. It was a man's voice, friendly and energetic, like any radio host. But what he was saying made my skin crawl. He was describing a hunting expedition, talking about tracking techniques, wind direction, the best way to approach prey. Nothing weird about that on the surface. Pennsylvania's big on hunting. Lots of stations run outdoor shows. But his terminology was off. He kept calling his targets the two legs and referring to neighborhoods as feeding grounds. He talked about tracking methods that had nothing to do with deer or turkey. He was describing how to follow someone by their fear scent and how to identify individuals by their heartbeat frequency. I grabbed the phone to call our engineer, but the line was dead. The static underneath the pirate broadcast was getting louder, and buried in that white noise, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, distorted, echoed, layered underneath the interference, saying things I'd said earlier in my shift but chopped up and rearranged like someone had been recording me. The hunting show host was still talking, his voice smooth and professional. He started giving coordinates. At first they meant nothing to me, just numbers, but then he said street names. Real streets in Wellsboro, East Avenue, Kelsey Street. He was describing specific locations in town, talking about tracking the two legs through these areas, noting which ones were isolated and which had good cover for approach. My hands were shaking as I tried everything I could think of to cut the signal, to get back control of my broadcast. Nothing worked. The pirate signal just got stronger, and now I could hear other sounds mixed in. Footsteps, heavy breathing, what might have been whimpering or crying. The host was still maintaining that cheerful, professional tone like he was discussing weekend fishing plans. Then he said something that made my heart stop. He gave another set of coordinates and said, "Excellent positioning at the broadcasting nest, Main Street, gas lamp district, second floor corner unit, visual confirmation on the two legs, female, blonde hair, blue sweater." I looked down at what I was wearing, blue sweater. I'm blonde. The studio is second floor, corner location, right above Main Street in the gas lamp district. He was describing me. I spun toward the window, and that's when I saw him. Standing directly under one of the gas lamps, perfectly still, looking up at my window. He was holding something that looked like radio equipment, some kind of modified receiver or transmitter, I couldn't tell. He was dressed in dark clothes, face shadowed by a hood, but I could see he was focused completely on the studio window. On me. The voice on the radio said, "Heart rate elevated. Breathing pattern indicates awareness. The two legs knows she's been selected. Fear scent will be optimal." I scrambled for my cell phone, dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher answered, and I was babbling, trying to explain that someone was broadcasting on our frequency, that there was a man outside watching me, that I needed help immediately. She stayed calm, said officers were on the way, told me to stay on the line and move away from the windows. I backed into the corner of the studio, phone pressed to my ear, eyes locked on that figure under the gas lamp. He hadn't moved, just standing there, equipment in hand, watching. The radio broadcast continued, and now the host was narrating in real time, describing my exact movements, how I'd backed away from the window, the angle of my body, the way I was holding the phone, things he couldn't possibly see from street level, not with the angle and distance involved. The dispatcher was asking me questions, and I was trying to answer, but I couldn't stop listening to that voice on the radio. He started talking about previous hunts, describing them in detail, dates, locations, outcomes. He used that same cheerful tone to describe what sounded like abductions, maybe murders. I don't know. The static would surge every few seconds, and during those surges, I'd hear my own voice again, saying things I definitely hadn't said. Things about being afraid, about being alone, about not knowing what was watching. I could see flashing lights approaching on Main Street. Police cruiser moving fast. The figure under the lamp didn't react at first, just kept standing there with that equipment. Then, maybe 5 seconds before the cruiser came into view, he moved. Not ran, moved. Smoothly, efficiently, stepping back into the shadows between buildings and disappearing so completely, it was like he'd never been there at all. The broadcast cut out the instant he vanished. Just stopped mid-sentence, and my station signal came back like nothing had ever interrupted it. The song that had been playing when the interference started picked up exactly where it had left off, like no time had passed at all. 2 officers came up to the studio, took my statement, searched the area where I'd seen the figure. They found nothing. No footprints in the patches of remaining snow, no equipment, no sign anyone had been there. But they took it seriously. I'll give them that. They called in the FCC, filed official reports, stayed with me until my replacement arrived for the rest of the shift. The FCC investigation took weeks. They analyzed recordings I'd made of the interference, tried to trace the signal source. What they found made no sense. According to their equipment, the pirate broadcast had originated from multiple locations simultaneously. A location deep in the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon about 15 miles away, an abandoned coal mine in Blossburg, and, impossibly, from inside the WCQB studio itself. 3 different source points, broadcasting the exact same signal at the exact same time. Their lead investigator told me he'd never seen anything like it, that the technology to pull off something like that shouldn't exist, at least not in civilian hands. I quit WCQB 2 weeks after the incident. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't sit in that studio knowing someone had been watching me, describing me, selecting me for whatever he was planning. I got a job at a clothing store downtown. Regular daytime hours, lots of people around. I don't listen to radio anymore, if I can help it, especially not late at night. But the story doesn't end there. Over the next few months, I started hearing things through local news networks, through friends who still worked in radio. 3 other stations across Pennsylvania, 1 in Bradford, 1 in Punxsutawney, 1 in Emporium, all small AM stations, all reported similar interference. Different operators, but the same hunting show broadcast, the same descriptions of tracking 2 legs through specific local areas. And in each case, within 48 hours of the broadcast, someone in that town disappeared. In Bradford, it was a night shift gas station attendant. Left his post during the early morning hours, never came home. They found his car still running at the station, register untouched, no signs of struggle. In Punxsutawney, a woman walking her dog around 11 p.m. The dog came back alone, leash dragging, no trace of the owner. In Emporium, a postal worker who'd been working late sorting packages. Security footage showed him leaving the post office, walking toward his car, and then the footage cut to static for exactly 17 minutes. When it came back, he was gone, and his car was still in the lot. I met with one of the other radio operators, the guy from Bradford, at a diner halfway between our towns. We compared notes, and it was identical. The interference, the hunting terminology, the feeling of being watched, that voice describing things it shouldn't be able to see. He told me he'd requested the FCC files on his incident, and found the same impossible result: multiple simultaneous transmission points, including one inside his own studio. The audio forensic specialist who analyzed all 4 broadcasts told us something that still keeps me up at night. She said that when she isolated and enhanced the static underneath the main voice, she found layers. Dozens of overlapping voices, maybe hundreds, all talking at once. She ran voice pattern analysis on every identifiable voice segment she could extract. Every single one matched missing persons reports from across Pennsylvania, cases dating back to 1962. People who'd vanished without a trace over 5 decades. All of them somehow part of this broadcast. I still live in Wellsboro. I see those gas lamps on Main Street every day, and I can't look at them without remembering that figure standing underneath, watching my window. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I'll hear what sounds like radio static, even though there's no radio on in my apartment. And in that static sometimes, I swear I can hear my own voice, distorted and far away, saying things I've never said, describing things I've never done, like somewhere, on some frequency I can't access, there's a version of that broadcast still running, still hunting, still selecting. The police never found the man under the gas lamp. The FCC closed their investigation, called it an unexplained interference event, filed it away. The missing persons cases remain unsolved. And I work retail now, surrounded by people and daylight, trying not to think about heartbeat frequencies and fear scent and what it means to be selected. But I know he's still out there. They're still out there, whoever or whatever they are, broadcasting on frequencies we can't block, watching through methods we can't detect, hunting in ways we don't understand. And every time I hear static, every time a radio signal cuts out for just a second, I wonder if it's starting again, if someone else is hearing that friendly, professional voice describing their location, their appearance, their elevated heart rate. If someone else is being selected, have you ever heard strange voices or interference on your radio late at night, especially on AM frequencies? What did they say, and did anything unusual happen in your town around that time? My name is Veda, and I'm a documentary photographer based out of Philadelphia. I specialize in historical preservation work, photographing old structures and forgotten places before they disappear completely. In September 2021, I got a contract to document abandoned farmsteads in Lancaster County for a historical society's archive project. Lancaster County is Amish country. Beautiful rolling farmland dotted with those distinctive barns and white farmhouses. Most of my subjects were properties that had been absorbed into larger farming operations or simply left to decay when families moved on. The work was peaceful, meditative even, wandering through these empty buildings and capturing what remained of lives long finished. That piece shattered completely when I found the farmstead on Leacock Road. The property was about half a mile off Pennsylvania Route 340, accessible only by an overgrown dirt track that my Subaru barely managed. I'd gotten permission from the Historical Society, who'd gotten it from whoever technically owned the land now. The farmstead predated the current Amish settlement in the area by decades, maybe going back to the early 1800s based on the architectural style. The main house was partially collapsed, but the barn stood relatively intact, weathered wood silvered by years of sun and rain. It was a gorgeous September afternoon, that perfect early fall weather where the light gets golden and everything feels crisp and clear. I spent maybe an hour photographing the exterior, getting different angles, capturing details of the hand-hewn beams and the way vegetation had started reclaiming the foundation. The surrounding field stretched out in every direction, corn stubble from a recent harvest, distant tree lines marking property boundaries. I was completely alone, hadn't seen another vehicle since turning off the main road. When I finally entered the barn, I had to wait a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dimmer interior. Shafts of sunlight came through gaps in the walls and roof, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. The smell was what you'd expect. Old hay, dry wood, that particular mustiness of long abandonment. I started photographing the interior structure, the loft area, an old ladder leading up to what might have been a hayloft. That's when I noticed the walls. At first, I thought someone had done charcoal rubbings or some kind of folk art project. The interior walls were covered, absolutely covered, in handprints. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all in black, overlapping and crowding every available surface. They started about 3 feet off the ground and went up as high as maybe 7 feet. But as I got closer and really looked at them, my professional eye started cataloging details that didn't make sense. The prints were too small, like significantly smaller than adult hands, smaller even than you'd expect from teenagers. Children's hands, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, too thin, the palms too narrow, and the substance used to make them wasn't charcoal or paint. It had a texture to it, slightly raised off the wood, and the smell, once I got close enough to really notice it, was like burnt honey mixed with sulfur, sweet and acrid at the same time, making my sinuses itch. I started photographing them systematically, moving along the wall, documenting this bizarre installation or whatever it was. My mind was trying to rationalize it. Maybe some artist had used this space. Maybe it was part of some historical practice I wasn't familiar with. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong about those handprints. They made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't articulate. Near the back of the barn, I found stairs leading down. A root cellar, probably, pretty standard for farmsteads of this era. The door at the bottom was partially open, and I could see darkness beyond. I should have left it alone. Every instinct was telling me to get back in my car and leave, but I'm a photographer, and documenting the complete property was literally my job. So I pulled out my phone for the flashlight function and headed down those stairs. The root cellar was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a hard-packed dirt floor and stone walls, and arranged in a precise circle in the center of the space were 7 wooden figures. Each one had been carved from a single piece of wood, maybe 18 inches tall, depicting a child in a kneeling position with hands clasped in prayer. The craftsmanship was incredible, really detailed. Each face unique with individual features carved carefully. But the expressions were what got me. They all looked terrified, mouths open like they were screaming, eyes wide, every line of their tiny wooden bodies suggesting absolute horror, frozen in prayer position. I moved closer, shining my light on them. Each figure had a name carved into its base in what looked like Pennsylvania Dutch, the old German dialect. I couldn't read most of it, but I could make out names: Johann, Elizabeth, Samuel, children's names from another century. That's when I made my second mistake. I reached out and touched one of the figures. The moment my fingers made contact with the wood, I heard them. Children singing, high and clear, but not in German, not in any language I recognized. The words were guttural, harsh, nothing like the sweet German hymns you sometimes hear in Amish communities. The singing seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the small cellar space until it was all I could hear. I jerked my hand back, but the singing didn't stop. My phone light flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. I could taste something in my mouth, earthy and metallic, like I'd bitten down on dirt mixed with old blood. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath, could feel the cold settling into my bones. Then I felt hands touching me. Small hands, ice cold, dozens of them, grabbing at my arms, my legs, my shoulders. They were positioning me, forcing my arms into prayer position, bending my knees, pushing me down toward the dirt floor. The singing got louder, more frantic, and those small, cold fingers were incredibly strong, irresistible. I tried to scream, but something was pressing against my mouth, covering it. I was being pulled downward. I could feel the packed dirt floor beneath my knees, but the hands kept pulling, and I was sinking into it like it was quicksand. The earth was giving way beneath me, and those tiny fingers were guiding me down, down into the ground. The singing reached a fever pitch, and in the chaos of sound, I could make out words in English now, children's voices begging, pleading, "Join us. Pray with us. Stay with us forever." My hand found my phone in my pocket, and I managed to activate the light. The bright LED flare cut through the darkness like a knife, and suddenly the hands were gone. The singing cut off mid-note. I was kneeling on the dirt floor, my arms in prayer position, but I was alone. Completely alone in that cellar, with those 7 wooden figures staring at me with their screaming faces. I ran, scrambled up those stairs, on my hands and knees, bursting out into the barn's dusty sunlight, gasping and shaking. I didn't look back, didn't stop to grab my camera bag properly, just snatched it up and sprinted for my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but I managed, and I drove that overgrown track faster than was remotely safe, bouncing over ruts and rocks until I hit the paved road. I drove straight to the Historical Society office and told them I couldn't complete the assignment. Made up some excuse about structural instability, unsafe conditions. They were disappointed, but understanding. Later that week, I contacted an Amish historian I knew, described the property location, asked if he knew anything about its history. What he told me made my blood run cold. The farmstead had belonged to a splinter religious sect that had broken away from the main Amish community in the early 1840s. They'd been expelled from the church for what the records vaguely described as sinful offerings and practices against God's law. The sect had occupied that farmstead from 1841 to 1843, when they'd suddenly vanished. All of them, gone overnight. The community had investigated and found the farmstead abandoned but otherwise normal, except for one detail that stuck in the historical record. 7 children from surrounding Amish farms had disappeared during those same years, between 1841 and 1843. They'd vanished from their beds, from fields where they'd been playing, from church gatherings. No bodies were ever found. No explanations were ever provided. The cases remained the worst unsolved mystery in Lancaster County Amish history. I asked the historian if he had any record of the missing children's names. He did. He sent me a list, 7 names including Johann, Elizabeth, and Samuel. The exact names I'd seen carved into those wooden figures. When I got home and uploaded my photos from the barn, I almost deleted everything immediately. Every single image I'd taken inside the root cellar showed shadows behind me. Small shadows, child-sized, clustered in the darkness just beyond my phone's light. In the clearest photo, you can see them reaching toward me with those 2 long fingers. 7 distinct shadows for 7 wooden figures. I developed tinnitus about a week after the incident. Constant ringing in my ears that doctors can't explain, can't treat. Except it's not really ringing. When it's quiet, when I'm alone, I can hear it properly. It's children singing in that harsh guttural language. Very faint, very distant, but always there. Always calling. I burned my camera that had taken the cellar photos. Couldn't stand to use it anymore. Couldn't stop seeing those shadows every time I looked through the viewfinder. I quit doing historical preservation work entirely. Switched to portrait photography, weddings, events, things involving living people in bright spaces with lots of witnesses. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and find my arms positioned in prayer. I don't remember doing it, don't remember moving them, and my knees will be dirty, covered in soil that smells like that root cellar, even though I'm in my 3rd floor apartment with no dirt anywhere nearby. On those nights, I can taste earth and old blood, and the singing in my ears gets loud enough that I can almost make out words. They're still calling, still waiting in that cellar with their wooden effigies and their impossible hunger, still reaching up through the dirt, looking for someone to complete their circle. 7 children taken, 7 figures carved, 7 voices singing in the darkness beneath an abandoned farmstead on Leacock Road. I'll never go back to Lancaster County. Never photograph another abandoned property. Never kneel in prayer again, because I know what's waiting in that position, what comes when you make yourself small and helpless and offering. Some offerings were made in that farmstead between 1841 and 1843. Some terrible bargain was struck, some price was paid, and the children who paid it are still there, still waiting, still singing their awful song in a language that predates the Pennsylvania Dutch, predates the German, predates anything brought to this continent by settlers. They're waiting for the 8th figure, the 8th name, the 8th voice to join their eternal prayer in the darkness. If you've ever explored abandoned properties in Amish country or anywhere else, did you find strange religious artifacts or symbols you couldn't explain? What happened afterward? Share your story below. My name is Easton, and I work construction. Been doing it for 20 years. Started as a laborer right out of high school and worked my way up to foreman. In January 2012, I was 42 and running a crew for a commercial development company out of Johnstown. We got contracted for site preparation work in Nanty Glo, this little town in Cambria County, maybe 3,000 people, tucked into the mountains of western Pennsylvania. The job was straightforward enough. Clear and level an old mining property for a new strip mall. The site was the former Benton mine location, closed since 1967 after a collapse. We were supposed to have it ready for foundation work in 3 weeks. We didn't make it past 9 days. Nanty Glo's got that classic Pennsylvania coal town feel. Houses built into hillsides, narrow streets, everything a little worn down but still functioning. The mine property was on Route 271, heading north out of town, maybe 40 acres of overgrown scrubland, with some remaining infrastructure from the mining operation. Most of it had been demolished or salvaged decades ago, but you could still see where the main shaft had been. Where the processing building stood, the outline of old rail lines in the dirt. My crew was 4 guys plus me. Good workers, experienced. The kind of team where everyone knows their job and gets it done without much supervision needed. We started work on a Monday morning. Temperature in the low 20s, snow on the ground from the weekend. Standard excavation work, running the backhoe to clear debris and level the grade. Nothing complicated. Day 1 went fine. Day 2 was normal. Day 3, Wednesday, January 18th. At exactly 3 p.m., we all heard it. A whistle. The old-style shift whistle they used to use in mines to signal end of day. Long, loud, unmistakable. It came from underground, somewhere beneath the work site, echoing up through the frozen ground. We all stopped what we were doing and looked at each other. My equipment operator killed the backhoe engine, and in the sudden silence we could hear the whistle fading away. I figured it had to be some kind of echo, maybe from the town's volunteer fire department, or something carrying weird over the hills. We joked about it, got back to work, forgot about it by quitting time. Thursday at 3 p.m., it happened again. Same whistle, same duration, definitely coming from below us. This time, I radioed the site office, asked if there were any active operations nearby that might be running shift whistles. They checked. Nothing. The nearest active industrial site was 12 miles away. I called the Nanty Glo borough office, asked about the old mine. The clerk told me the Benton mine whistle had been removed and scrapped in 1968, year after the mine closed. She sounded confused about why I was asking. Friday, same thing. 3 p.m. exactly, whistle from underground. My crew was getting spooked. One of my guys, Kevin, mentioned during lunch break that he'd been having weird dreams about being underground, about waiting for something. I brushed it off, told him it was just the atmosphere of working on an old mine site getting into his head. But that weekend, I had the dreams too, standing in darkness, hearing water dripping, waiting, just waiting. For what? I didn't know. But the feeling was overwhelming. This sense of anticipation, of knowing something was supposed to happen at a specific time. I'd wake up disoriented, checking the clock, feeling like I'd missed something important. Monday, the whistle at 3 p.m. Tuesday, same thing. By now, we'd all gotten used to it in a way, but the crew was acting strange. During breaks, instead of sitting in the warming trailer or the trucks, guys would sit in the excavated areas, just staring at the ground. When I asked what they were doing, they'd look confused, like they didn't realize they'd been doing it. Kevin started mumbling during work, and when I got close enough to hear him, he was saying something about waiting for the cage. That's what miners called the elevator, the cage that took them down and brought them back up. I pulled him aside, asked if he was feeling all right. He looked at me like he didn't understand the question, then seemed to snap out of it. Said he was fine, didn't remember saying anything about a cage. But an hour later, I caught him doing it again, standing in a hole we dug, looking down, whispering about the cage. Wednesday night, I woke up at 2:55 a.m. in my hotel room in Johnstown. I was already out of bed, already dressed in my work boots and hard hat. I had no memory of getting up, no memory of putting them on. I was standing in the middle of the room, staring at the floor, and as I came to full awareness, I heard it. The whistle, muffled but clear, coming from beneath me, from underground. At 3 a.m. exactly, I felt this overwhelming compulsion to dig, not with equipment, with my hands. I needed to dig down, needed to reach something, needed to get below. It took every ounce of willpower I had to resist, and I barely managed. I sat on the bed, shaking, watching my hands tremble with the effort of not clawing at the hotel room floor. When I looked down, my fingernails were bleeding. The carpet around the bed was torn up in several places, long gouges where I'd been scratching at it. I had no memory of doing it, but the evidence was right there, and my fingers hurt like hell. I called in sick Thursday, couldn't face going to the site, but I couldn't stay away either. Friday morning I was back, and the crew looked like I felt, exhausted, confused, frightened. Nobody was talking much. We were all just going through the motions, operating equipment, moving dirt, but there was this tension building, this sense that something was going to happen. Friday at 3 p.m. the whistle blew, and this time, instead of just hearing it, I felt it. Felt it in my bones, in my teeth, vibrating through my entire body. The compulsion hit all of us simultaneously. Without discussing it, without planning it, all 5 of us stopped what we were doing and started digging. The guy on the backhoe abandoned the machine and joined us in the pit we'd excavated near the old shaft location. We were digging with our bare hands, tearing at frozen dirt and rocks, nails breaking, fingers bleeding, and we couldn't stop. I was aware of what I was doing, but couldn't control it. It was like being a passenger in my own body, watching my hands dig and scrape while some other part of my brain screamed at me to stop. We dug for hours. When it finally got dark and the compulsion released us, we'd gone down 12 feet, creating this rough shaft straight into the earth. Our hands were destroyed, bloody, and raw. None of us could explain why we'd done it. The development company pulled us off the site that night, sent us all for medical evaluation. The doctors diagnosed us with acute dissociative episodes and something they called shared delusional disorder. Basically, we'd all experienced the same psychotic break simultaneously. We went through psychiatric evaluation, medication, therapy. The project got reassigned to a different crew. I went on medical leave. But it didn't stop. Every day at 3 p.m., I lose time. Doesn't matter where I am, what I'm doing. I'll come to awareness 15-20 minutes later with no memory of what happened during that gap. Sometimes my hands are dirty. Sometimes I'm in a different room than where I started. Sometimes I'm just standing still, staring at the ground, waiting for something that never comes. The psychiatrist can't help. The medication doesn't work. I've learned to manage it, sort of. I make sure I'm somewhere safe at 3 p.m., somewhere I can't hurt myself or others during those lost minutes. I set alarms, leave notes for myself, try to maintain some control over a situation I fundamentally don't control. I did my own research on the Benton mine collapse, found the records in the county historical archives. It happened on January 12, 1967, At 2:57 p.m., 11 miners were working the deep shaft when a support gave way. The collapse sealed them in completely. No way to reach them, no way to get them out. The rescue effort lasted 3 days before they gave up. The bodies were never recovered. Those 11 men would have been waiting for the 3 p.m. whistle. That was shift change, when the cage would come down to bring them back to the surface. They died waiting for that whistle, trapped in the dark, probably hearing water seeping in, knowing no one was coming. And somehow, that waiting became permanent. Got into the ground, into the rock, into whatever dimensional space occupies the place where terrible things happen and don't end. I found out through an old contact at the development company that they did ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site after our incident. They detected a void space about 60 feet down, the original collapse chamber. The radar showed 11 distinct masses in that void, arranged in a circle, all oriented toward what would have been the location of the mineshaft elevator, toward where the cage would have come down. They're still waiting, still listening for that 3 p.m. whistle, still positioned to board the cage that will never come. And somehow, we connected with that waiting, became part of it. 5 of us who dug on that site in January 2012, and we're all still experiencing the same thing. Lost time every day at 3 p.m., the compulsion to dig, the sense of waiting for something just out of reach. I tried going back to the site once, about 6 months later. They'd abandoned the development project, left it as empty land. I stood where we dug that 12-foot pit, and at 3 p.m. I lost time like always. When I came to, I was lying at the bottom of the old pit, which had been partially filled in. I dug myself down 6 feet in 15 minutes, tearing through dirt and rocks with my bare hands. I was positioned like I was waiting for an elevator, facing the exact spot where the mine shaft used to be. I don't go near Nanty Glow anymore. Don't take jobs in Cambria County. Don't work on any sites with mining history. But it doesn't matter where I am. 3 p.m. comes, and I'm back there, waiting in the dark with 11 dead miners who don't know they're dead, listening for a whistle that calls us all to gather, to prepare, to wait for the cage. The worst part is knowing it's never going to end. Those miners have been waiting since 1967. It's been 57 years for them. For me, it's been 12 years, and counting. And every single day at 3 p.m. I join them in that waiting, in that eternal anticipation of rescue that will never arrive. Sometimes during those lost minutes, I think I'm not in my body anymore. I think I'm down there with them, standing in that circle in the flooded collapse chamber, positioned toward the shaft, listening to the drip of water and the creak of shifting rock, waiting for the sound of machinery, for the rattle of chains, for the cage descending to bring us home. The whistle blows, and we wait. We'll always wait. Have you ever worked on or visited a site where industrial disasters occurred? Did you experience lost time, compulsive behaviors, or the feeling that something was calling to you from underground? Tell us what happened in the comments. My name is Marigold, and I'm a structural engineer based out of Scranton. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent most of my career working on bridge inspection and preservation projects across Pennsylvania. In August 2020, I got assigned to conduct a routine structural assessment of the Tunkhannock Viaduct in Nicholson, Wyoming County. If you're not familiar with it, the viaduct is this absolutely massive concrete railroad bridge built in 1915, tallest of its kind in the United States, these enormous arches spanning the Tunkhannock Creek Valley. It's a stunning piece of engineering, and I was genuinely excited about the project. That excitement died pretty quickly once I got underneath those arches and saw what was happening to the concrete. The assessment was scheduled for mid-August, perfect weather for this kind of work. Nicholson's a tiny borough, maybe 800 people, and the viaduct dominates everything. You can see it from anywhere in town, this monolithic structure cutting across the valley. I arrived on a Tuesday morning with my equipment, cameras, measuring tools, a rappelling gear for accessing the underside of the arches. The Preservation Society wanted detailed documentation of concrete condition, any structural degradation, recommendations for maintenance. Standard stuff I'd done dozens of times on other historic bridges. I started with exterior photography, getting overall documentation from ground level and from various vantage points around the valley. The viaduct is genuinely beautiful from below. 15 massive concrete arches, each one soaring over 200 feet high. You get this incredible sense of scale standing underneath, looking up at all that concrete and steel holding up active railroad track. Freight trains still use this bridge daily, rumbling across with loads of coal and shipping containers. After lunch, I geared up for the technical inspection. This meant rappelling down from the track level to access the arch faces and undersides where you can really see what's happening with the concrete. I had my safety harness, my cameras with macro lenses for capturing detail shots, my calipers, and laser measuring equipment. I anchored my lines and went over the edge. Hanging there in my harness, slowly working my way along the arch face, I started noticing something odd about the concrete surface. The weathering patterns weren't random like you'd normally see. They formed shapes, distinct shapes that looked disturbingly like human faces. Not subtle pareidolia where your brain interprets random patterns as faces, but actual detailed formations. Screaming faces, dozens of them, all expressing absolute terror. The mouths were open wide, the eyes bulging, every line suggesting pain and horror frozen in concrete. I started photographing them systematically, thinking this was some kind of unusual erosion phenomenon I'd need to document. But the more I looked, the more unsettled I became. The faces were too consistent, too detailed. I got out my calipers and started measuring. Every single face was exactly 7 inches from the crown of the head to the bottom of the chin. Exactly. Not approximately, precisely 7 inches down to the millimeter. That's not how natural weathering works. Natural processes create variation, irregularity. This was uniform. I pulled out my notebook where I'd copied some construction history before the trip. The Tunkhannock Viaduct had employed approximately 2,300 workers during its construction from 1912 to 1915. Official records showed 38 fatalities during that time. Falls, equipment accidents, the usual dangers of large-scale construction in that era. I did the math. 2,300 divided by 38 equals roughly 60. I started counting the faces on the arch section I was inspecting. 60 faces. I moved to an adjacent section, 60 more. Different faces, different expressions, but the same count. 15 arches on the viaduct. 60 faces per arch. That's 900 faces total. My hands were shaking as I tried to process this. The wind coming through the valley was making a sound through the arches, and I realized it wasn't random wind noise. It had a rhythm to it, almost like breathing from multiple throats, all slightly out of sync. The temperature felt wrong, too. Warmer than it should be in the shade of these massive concrete structures. I tried to refocus on the technical work. I needed measurements, documentation, material samples. I activated my laser level to check for any structural displacement or movement in the concrete. The equipment started acting strange immediately. The laser, which should project a perfectly straight reference line, was showing the viaduct in multiple positions simultaneously. The readout made no sense. It was showing the bridge existing in several different spatial locations at once, occupying space that geometrically couldn't work. I felt dizzy suddenly, like vertigo, but worse. The faces in the concrete were moving, not metaphorically, literally moving. The mouths were opening wider, the stone flowing like liquid, reshaping itself. I could taste metal and ozone in my mouth. That flavor you get right before a lightning strike. The air pressure was changing, my ears popping like I was rapidly ascending or descending. The geometry of the viaduct looked wrong. The angles didn't make sense. I work with structural geometry every day. I know what right angles look like. how curves should behave, what parallel lines do. This wasn't following those rules. The arches seemed to curve in directions that weren't possible, existing in more dimensions than the three I could perceive. Looking directly at certain sections made my eyes hurt, made my brain scream that what I was seeing couldn't exist. I pulled out my phone to take comparison photos, trying to document what was happening. Through the phone screen, I could see myself in 5 different positions on the bridge simultaneously, 5 versions of me, all hanging in harnesses at different points along the arch, all existing at the same moment. I lowered the phone and looked with my naked eye. I was in 1 position. Raised the phone again, 5 positions. The phone was showing me something my brain refused to process directly. A freight train started crossing the viaduct above me, and the vibration traveled through the concrete. That rumbling, shaking sensation seemed to snap reality back into place, like breaking a spell. The faces stopped moving. The geometry looked normal again. My laser level started giving consistent readings. I was in 1 position, 1 body, 1 moment, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew what this structure was. I ascended back to track level, packed my equipment with trembling hands, and sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to steady my breathing before I could drive. When I got back to my hotel room, I downloaded all the photos from my cameras and reviewed them. The faces showed up clearly in every image, detailed, screaming, consistent. But in the photos where I'd been trying to document the geometric impossibilities, I appeared in multiple positions. The same shot, the same timestamp, but 5 versions of me hanging from different points on the viaduct, all present simultaneously. I wrote up my initial report for the Preservation Society, kept it technical and vague, noted unusual surface erosion patterns requiring further analysis, recommended additional study, didn't mention faces or impossible geometry, or the feeling that the bridge exists in more than 3 dimensions. They'd think I was having a breakdown, but I contacted a physicist colleague from my graduate program at Penn State, someone I trusted. I sent her the photos showing the multiple position anomaly. She called me 2 days later, voice shaking. She'd run analysis on the images, specifically on the geometric structure of the viaduct as it appeared in those photos. She said the mathematics didn't work. The viaduct's geometry in those images contained equations that shouldn't exist, spatial relationships that violated fundamental principles of physics. According to her analysis, the structure wasn't just a bridge. It was some kind of dimensional anchor, a point where normal 3-dimensional space intersected with something else. The concrete itself appeared to contain properties that allowed it to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. She asked me where the bridge was, what it was made of, how it was built. I started digging into construction records more thoroughly. The official count was 38 worker deaths during construction, but I found unindexed documents in the Wyoming County Historical Archives, purchase orders, and labor records that didn't make it into the official history. According to these documents, 900 workers were reported missing during the viaduct's construction between 1912 and 1915. Not dead, not injured, missing. They simply disappeared from the work site. No bodies recovered, no explanations given, no investigations were ever conducted. The contractors just kept hiring more workers to replace the ones who vanished. The concrete was poured continuously for 3 years, these massive continuous pours that went on for days at a time. You'd need immense amounts of material for a structure this size, and according to the records, they used significantly more concrete than the engineering specifications called for. I think I know where those 900 workers went. I think they became part of the structure, absorbed into the concrete during those massive pours. Their bodies, and maybe something more fundamental than their bodies. Their dimensional existence, their ability to occupy space, used as some kind of binding agent for whatever impossible geometry was being constructed. The viaduct is still there, still in use, trains crossing it every day. I developed permanent double vision after that inspection. Not severe, but persistent. I see everything slightly offset, like reality is layered, and I'm perceiving multiple layers at once. I have spatial disorientation issues now, trouble judging distances, difficulty with depth perception. The world doesn't look quite right anymore, doesn't follow the geometric rules I spent years learning. I can't work on bridge inspections anymore. I'm on medical leave, supposedly temporary, but realistically permanent. How do you inspect structural integrity when you can't trust what your eyes are telling you about space and dimension? I've moved into consulting work, reviewing other engineers' reports for my home office, staying away from actual structures. Sometimes I'll be looking at a building or a bridge in the distance, and I'll see it in multiple positions simultaneously, existing in several states at once. It lasts just a moment before my brain compensates and forces everything back into normal three-dimensional perception. But I know what I'm seeing is real. I know there are structures in this world that don't follow the rules, that exist partially in dimensions we don't have names for. The Tunkhannock Viaduct is one of them, a monument built with 900 lives, 900 dimensional anchors holding something in place that shouldn't be here. Those faces in the concrete aren't just erosion or pareidolia. They're impressions left behind by people who were compressed into something that exists in more than 3 dimensions. They're screams, frozen across multiple planes of reality simultaneously. I still have nightmares about hanging under those arches, feeling reality bend around me, seeing myself in 5 positions at once. In the nightmares, I can't get back up. I'm stuck there, and slowly I feel myself splitting, existing in more positions, spreading out across dimensional space until I'm not one person anymore, but a pattern distributed across realities, screaming silently in concrete. The Preservation Society wants me to complete the assessment, to go back and finish the documentation. They've called twice, sent emails. I haven't responded. I can't go back there. I won't hang underneath those arches again, won't expose myself to whatever dimensional property that structure possesses. Those 900 workers are still there, still screaming across dimensions we can't perceive, their faces emerging in the concrete as 3-dimensional shadows of existences that have been smeared across higher dimensions. And the viaduct stands, carrying trains across the valley, a monument to something we built without understanding, using methods and materials that created something profoundly wrong with reality itself. I see it in my peripheral vision sometimes, even though I'm nowhere near Nicholson. The viaduct existing in multiple places simultaneously, its geometry spreading like a crack in reality. Maybe I brought something back with me that day. Maybe hanging there, exposed to whatever that structure is, changed something fundamental about how I exist in space. I'm scared to find out what that means. Have you ever visited the Tunkhannock Viaduct or other historic bridges and felt unusual disorientation, seen geometric impossibilities, or experienced strange perceptual shifts? Did photographs show anything different from what you witnessed in person? My name is Jordan, and I'm a food safety inspector for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. I'm 37 years old, been doing this work for 12 years, conducting routine inspections of restaurants, processing facilities, anything that handles food commercially. In June 2019, I got assigned to inspect a traditional smokehouse operation in Bird in Hand, Lancaster County. Bird in Hand is right in the heart of Amish country, beautiful farmland, horse-drawn buggies sharing the roads with cars, that whole picturesque Pennsylvania Dutch experience tourists come to see. The smokehouse I was inspecting had been family-owned for 6 generations, operating since the 1700s on Old Philadelphia Pike, which is Route 340. They had an excellent reputation, won awards for their smoked meats, supplied restaurants across 3 states. I went in expecting a routine inspection and came out knowing things about human nature I wish I could forget. The facility was immaculate from the outside. Well-maintained buildings, clean grounds, everything you'd want to see. The owner, an older Amish man who introduced himself as Jakob, met me at the entrance with a friendly handshake. He wore traditional plain clothes, spoke with that slight Pennsylvania Dutch accent, seemed genuinely welcoming. He offered me samples of their products right away, pointing out their award plaques on the wall, explaining their smoking techniques that had been passed down through generations. I started with the standard inspection protocol, checking temperatures in storage areas, examining sanitation practices, reviewing acquisition and processing records. Everything looked good initially. The cold storage was properly maintained. The processing areas were clean. The paperwork seemed in order. Jakob followed me around, answering questions, providing documentation when I asked for it. Then I moved into the actual cold storage to examine meat cuts directly. This is where I look at the products themselves, check for proper labeling, make sure nothing's contaminated or improperly stored. I was examining cuts of what Jakob had labeled as wild boar, specialty game meat they processed for high-end restaurants. The marbling pattern caught my eye immediately. It was wrong. I've inspected thousands of meat cuts over my career. I know what pork looks like, what beef looks like, what game meat looks like. This didn't match any of those patterns. The joint structure was off too. The way the bones articulated, the angle of the cuts. Something fundamental was wrong with the anatomy. I pulled out another cut, examined it more closely. That's when I found the fingernail, a human fingernail, still partially attached to tissue, embedded in what was supposed to be wild boar shoulder. My stomach dropped. I looked at Jakob, who was standing in the doorway of the cold storage. He smiled, that same friendly Amish grandfather smile, and said very calmly that it must be from the wild pig. They sometimes processed hunted game, he explained, and wild pigs have similar nail structures to humans. That's a lie. I know anatomy. That was a human fingernail with cuticle and nail bed intact. I told Jakob I needed to see all acquisition records immediately, where they were getting their meat, documentation of sources, inspection certificates for any game processing. He became evasive, said some records were in the office, some were stored elsewhere. He'd need time to gather everything. That's a red flag. Legitimate operations have their paperwork accessible and organized. I moved to the main smokehouse chamber while Jakob went to supposedly get records. The smoking room was exactly what you'd expect. Large brick chamber, hooks for hanging meat, wood chip burners, temperature controls. But the smell was wrong. I've been in hundreds of smokehouses. They smell like wood smoke, cured meat, salt, spices. This smelled like all that, but underneath was something else, something that made my mouth water despite my growing horror, some scent that was intoxicating and fundamentally wrong at the same time. The temperature logs were posted on the wall, and I started reviewing them. The facility was running continuous operations, 72 hours straight, multiple times per month. That's unusual. Most smokehouses run batch operations, process for specific periods, then shut down. Continuous operation like this suggests either very high volume or something else. I found the modified grinding room by accident, following a trail of what I thought was water on the floor. Jakob had tried to steer me away from that section, said it was under renovation, not currently in use, but the door was partially open, and I saw fresh blood on the floor. Not a small amount, fresh pooling blood that was still liquid. I pushed the door open despite Jakob's protests. The room contained industrial meat grinding equipment, all of it recently used and poorly cleaned. There were clothing scraps caught in one grinder's mechanism, modern clothing, polyester blend fabric, not hunting gear. In the floor drain, I found dental work, a crown, modern dental work, gold and porcelain, unmistakably human. Jakob stopped pretending at that point. He stood in the doorway, blocking my exit, and his entire demeanor changed. The friendly grandfather disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. He told me very matter-of-factly that their community had been sustaining themselves this way since they crossed from Germany in 1738. Not the mainstream Amish. They split off early, formed their own sect with their own practices. They'd refined the process over centuries, he said, turned it into an art form. He talked about it like he was discussing traditional cheese-making or furniture craftsmanship, explained how they selected sources, how they processed the meat to remove identifying characteristics, how their smoking techniques created the flavor profile that had won them awards. He said they had a very exclusive customer base, people who knew exactly what they were purchasing and paid premium prices for it. Then he offered me a choice, phrased as a business proposition. I could become a permanent supply contract consultant. They'd pay me exceptionally well to ignore what I'd seen and help them navigate any future regulatory issues. Or I could maintain permanent silence through other means, and his tone made it clear what those other means would be. I told him I needed to use the bathroom, needed a moment to think about his offer. He allowed it, probably thinking I was actually considering it. The moment I was out of sight, I ran, just bolted for the entrance, got to my state vehicle, locked the doors, and called 911 while driving away as fast as I could. The police raid happened within 2 hours. State police, county sheriff, the works. They found evidence of 3 recent victims. Identification documents hidden in Jakob's office, personal effects, enough physical evidence to make the case. Jakob died during the arrest, apparent massive heart attack. He was 76 years old. The coroner ruled it natural causes brought on by stress. 17 other community members were arrested over the following weeks. The investigation expanded to 4 other Pennsylvania Amish communities where similar operations were discovered. All shut down quietly. The media reported it as a rogue criminal operation, never mentioned the full scope, never explained the century-spanning tradition Jakob had described. I went through months of trauma counseling, got diagnosed with severe PTSD and something called persistent disgust disorder, a psychological condition where you can't stop feeling contaminated and repulsed. I can't eat meat anymore, can't even smell it cooking without feeling nauseous. I have nightmares about that smokehouse, about the smell that made my mouth water, even as I was discovering what it actually was. The trial revealed details I wish I didn't know. The FBI found customer distribution lists with over 200 addresses across 6 states. People who'd been buying this meat knowingly, purchasing it specifically because of what it was. Most of those buyers were never identified. The investigation got shut down at the federal level, classified for reasons nobody would explain to me. I learned during depositions that the operation had been running successfully for decades, probably longer. Jakob's family had perfected the supply chain, the processing, the distribution. They had connections throughout the region, knew how to acquire sources that wouldn't be missed. Homeless people, undocumented immigrants, runaways, people who disappeared without raising alarms. I can't work in food safety anymore, can't set foot in a processing facility, can't inspect a restaurant kitchen, can't even go grocery shopping without having panic attacks. I'm on permanent disability leave, living off settlements, and trying to build some kind of life that doesn't involve food or meat or the memory of that smell that was intoxicating and horrifying in equal measure. But what keeps me awake at night isn't just what I discovered. It's knowing how many people were part of it, how many customers knew exactly what they were eating and kept ordering it, how many other communities might have similar operations that we haven't found, how many restaurants might have served it without knowing, or worse, knowing perfectly well. The 4 communities we shut down were all in Pennsylvania. Jakob mentioned their sect had been practicing this since 1738. That's almost 300 years. How many people died to sustain that tradition? How many victims never got identified, never got justice, just got processed and smoked and served to customers who paid premium prices? I testified at every trial, gave depositions, helped prosecutors build their cases. Most of the 17 who were arrested got significant prison time, but 6 were released on technicalities. Insufficient evidence to prove their direct involvement. They're back in their communities now, back to their lives, and I have to live with knowing they're out there. Sometimes I'll be driving through Lancaster County. Can't always avoid it, and it's right in the middle of the state, and I'll see traditional smoke houses operating on Amish farms. And I can't help but wonder. Can't help looking at the smoke rising from those buildings and questioning whether it's legitimate business or something darker. Whether the families running those operations are genuine artisans or part of that 3-century tradition Jacob described. I reported everything to every authority I could think of. Health Department, FBI, State Attorney General. Got told repeatedly that the cases were closed, the threat was neutralized, no evidence suggested any ongoing operations, but they haven't looked everywhere. They can't monitor every small family smokehouse in every rural community. And the customer base is still out there. 200-plus buyers who were never identified, never charged, never faced consequences. They're still hungry. What would you do if you discovered your favorite restaurant or food supplier was selling something unthinkable, but telling you the truth would destroy your career and maybe your life? My name is Arthur, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a historical restoration specialist, meaning most of my time is spent inside old buildings, churches, and other landmarks, assessing damage and preserving the structure's original design. In November 2023, I was in Jim Thorpe, Carbon County, Pennsylvania, a mountain town with a population of just under 5,000, famous for its steep streets, haunting history, and Victorian architecture. My assignment was to document and restore details of St. Mark's and St. John's Episcopal Church on Race Street, a Victorian-era structure with a bell tower that dominates the skyline. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt the chill of November rain soaking through cracked stained glass and warped floorboards. The caretaker, an elderly man with a rain-beaten coat, greeted me just inside the doorway. He told me to stick to the sanctuary and avoid the bell tower, which he said was structurally unsound. I politely agreed, but I was trained to investigate every architectural element. The bell tower was the oldest part of the building, and I wanted images for the restoration grant application. That first day, I studied the interior, the intricate woodwork, and centuries-old murals. The church was quiet, except for the sound of rain against the colored windows. As I documented the property, I was captivated by the vibrant mosaics beneath the dust. I could taste copper every time I breathed in the chill air, and I felt vibrations through the floors that prickled my skin, like static before a storm. Around dusk, I heard a single church bell ring, a clear, resonant toll that lasted only a couple of seconds. The caretaker looked up from his ledger and shook his head. "Hasn't rung since '52, he whispered. "Not since the crack. Not since the fire." I felt sudden pressure in my ears, a sharp metal taste on my tongue. The room plummeted in temperature as if someone had opened a freezer. I wrote off the sensation as nerves until the bell rang again, this time with a harsh scream layered beneath the metallic sound. Ignoring the warnings, I climbed the rickety stairs towards the tower, camera in hand. Each step creaked and groaned, the wooden rail sticky beneath my palm. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and old books. When I reached the top, I found the bell swinging, not from a rope, but seemingly moved by an invisible hand. The walls around it were scorched, blackened by old fire, and carved into the bronze of the bell were dozens of handprints, burnt like brands, each distinct and horrifying. I ran my hand over the wall and felt a phantom warmth that pulsed like breath. As I set up a shot, the bell tolled again, the sound no longer metallic, but a chorus of screams reverberating through the tower and shaking my bones. Images flickered at the edge of my vision, names etched into stone, 67, all dated 1897. I tasted bitterness, mouth dry, heart pounding. The bell's vibrations rattled my teeth. Heat radiated from scorched stone, so intense I squinted and felt the skin on my face tighten. I closed my eyes and felt myself slipping. Suddenly, it was 1897, and the tower was ablaze. Children were trapped, banging on doors that wouldn't open, their voices swallowed by fire and enveloped in church smoke. The bell rang despite the flames, an alarm for help that never came. The walls pressed in. I felt hands reaching through dense heat, grasping, pleading, burning with desperate energy. In a flash, I was back, collapsed on the scorched boards. The screaming bell went silent. I scrambled down the stairs, hands trembling, sweat soaked with soot and dust. Later, researching local records, I confirmed the church fire on June 14th, 1897. 67 fatalities, mostly children trapped during Sunday school, door jammed, their names now etched ghost-like in the bell tower. Locals whispered about how the bell rang continuously, echoing across the valley while the fire burned. Weeks passed, and I couldn't forget the thermal patterns my camera had captured. 67 heat signatures surrounding me in every image, reaching toward the lens. I visited the site with a thermal expert. The readings matched burning human bodies, clustered around my position, although I was there alone. The expert was shaken, refused further tests. Meanwhile, I developed hearing loss at a specific frequency, the exact resonance of the bell. Sometimes I wake to find burns on my fingers, although my apartment is perfectly normal. I refuse offers for further restoration projects in churches. The feeling I had in the bell tower, pressure, intense heat, unseen hands desperate to escape, returns every time I step inside a place touched by tragedy. I know that bell didn't just ring for help. It absorbed every scream into its core. Now, every time it moves, it releases echoes from the fire. There's one photo I can't delete. A perfectly clear thermal shot from the tower showing burning bodies clustered around the bell, hands outstretched. They're reaching beyond time, seeking release that never came. Next time you're in an old church and hear a bell ring, even when no rope is pulled, would you go investigate? Or would you leave behind whatever secrets that sound might hold? Tell me, what would you have done? And have you ever felt the echoes of a tragedy nobody talks about? My name is Billy, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in river otter populations. I'm 33 years old, based out of Pittsburgh, and I spend a lot of time in remote fieldwork situations studying animal behavior patterns. In April 2022, I rented a cabin near Ohiopyle State Park in Fayette County for a 2-week research stint. Ohiopyle is barely a town, population 59, basically just the state park and a few scattered buildings along the Youghiogheny River. The isolation was exactly what I needed for focused observation work. What I didn't anticipate was becoming the subject of observation myself. The cabin I rented sat 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessed by a winding dirt road called Sugarloaf that cut through dense forest. No cell service, which was fine. I had a satellite phone for emergencies. The property backed onto thick woods, with the river about a 1/4 mile away through the trees. Perfect setup for my research, which involved monitoring otter activity patterns using trail cameras positioned along the riverbank. The first 3 nights were exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet, productive, peaceful in that way only deep wilderness can be. I'd spend days checking cameras, reviewing footage, taking notes on otter behavior. Evenings, I'd cook simple meals, read by lamplight, sleep deeply in that complete silence you only get miles from civilization. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat, where every small sound, an owl calling, a branch cracking, rings out clear and distinct. Night 4, something changed. I woke up around 3 in the morning with that feeling you get when something's off but you can't identify what. Nothing looked different in the cabin. I checked the doors, locked, windows, secure. But when I went to make coffee at dawn, I noticed my research equipment had been moved. Not dramatically, just slightly repositioned. My trail cameras, which I'd left charging on the table, were now facing different directions. The one that had been pointing at the wall was now aimed at the bedroom door. The one facing the window now pointed at my bed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd moved them while half asleep and didn't remember. Maybe the table wasn't level and they'd shifted. But my field notes were out of order too. Pages I'd carefully organized were now mixed up, like someone had been reading through them and put them back wrong. My skin prickled with unease, but I was alone out here. The doors had been locked all night. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the silence, which suddenly didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt oppressive, unnatural. No insect sounds, no night birds, no wind through the trees. Just absolute perfect silence pressing down like a physical weight. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me stop breathing. Footsteps. Multiple sets crunching through leaves outside, circling the cabin, slowly, methodically. I grabbed my flashlight and my satellite phone, positioned myself where I could see out the window without being easily visible. The footsteps stopped. For maybe 10 minutes, nothing. Then I saw movement at the tree line. 3 figures standing perfectly still, just at the edge where the clearing met the forest. They weren't moving at all, not shifting weight, not looking around, nothing. Just standing there, watching the cabin. I kept the light off and watched them through the window. They stood there for hours, literally hours. I tracked the time. From 2:13 a.m. until 6:47 a.m., they didn't move, didn't sit, didn't walk around, just stood in perfect stillness. 3 dark shapes against darker trees, facing the cabin. When dawn light finally made them more visible, I could see they were wearing ordinary clothes, jackets, jeans. But something about them looked wrong. Their posture was too rigid. Their faces, even from this distance, seemed too blank, too symmetrical, expressions completely neutral. At exactly 6:47, as full daylight broke, all 3 turned simultaneously, perfectly synchronized, like they were controlled by the same brain, and walked into the forest. Not quickly, not slowly, just steady mechanical steps until the trees swallowed them. I didn't go outside that day. I reviewed footage from my trail cameras, the ones I'd set up along the river for otter research. The cameras were motion activated, and they'd captured something during the night. 3 people walking through the forest, not along the river where otters would be, but on a direct path toward my cabin. The timestamp showed them passing the camera at 11:38 p.m. They were carrying equipment, binoculars, cameras with telephoto lenses, backpacks. But the footage showed something else too. The 3 figures walked in perfect unison, their steps synchronized exactly, all 3 placing feet in the same rhythm. And when the infrared caught their faces, their expressions were identical. Same neutral blankness, same slightly too wide eyes, same mechanical quality that made them look less like people and more like something pretending to be people. I tried the satellite phone. No signal, which was impossible. Satellite phones don't depend on local cell towers. I tried different locations around the cabin. Nothing. The device showed full battery but couldn't connect. I was effectively cut off. Night 5. I set up my laptop with the motion sensor software aimed at the windows. I positioned myself in a corner with a knife from the kitchen, not sleeping, just waiting. The sensors triggered at 1:53 a.m. I looked at the screen and felt my stomach drop. They were there again. 3 figures, but this time they were much closer, standing in the clearing, maybe 20 feet from the cabin, perfectly still, watching. I could see them clearly through the window. The moonlight was bright enough to make out details. They were wearing the same clothes as the previous night. Same positions, same spacing between them. But they were closer now, and I could see their faces properly. Too symmetrical. Features too perfectly balanced. Skin too smooth. They looked like computer renderings of human faces, like something had studied what humans should look like and created approximations that were almost right but fundamentally wrong. I kept every light off, barely breathing, watching them through the laptop screen. Hours passed. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. They never moved, never blinked, never shifted, never showed any sign of discomfort or fatigue. Just stood there, 3 statues in human shape, facing my cabin, watching. At 5:47 a.m. they moved. All 3 simultaneously looked down at something. Watches maybe, or phones. I couldn't tell. Then they turned, again in perfect synchronization, and walked toward the cabin. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I'd pass out. They walked right up to my door. I heard them stop. Heard nothing else. No breathing, no whispered conversation, no sound at all. They just stood there, on the other side of my door, for 8 minutes. Then I heard scratching, fingernails on wood, all around the cabin, on the door, the walls, the window frames. Dozens of fingernails scratching simultaneously, a horrible dry rustling sound that made my teeth ache. I looked out the window and saw them standing back from the cabin, but their arms were extended, fingers moving in scratching motions, even though they weren't touching anything. The scratching sounds continued, coming from surfaces they weren't near. At dawn, they left. Same mechanical synchronized walk into the forest. I packed immediately, loaded my car, got the hell out. I drove straight to the Ohio Pile police station, 2 officers for a town of 59 people. They listened to my story, reviewed my trail camera footage, drove back to the cabin with me. They found evidence of a camp in the woods nearby, sleeping bags, food, equipment, and cameras. Professional cameras with massive telephoto lenses set up on tripods, all aimed at my cabin. The camp had photographs, dozens of them, printed and pinned to trees. All of me. Through my cabin windows, sleeping, cooking, working, showering. Every private moment documented and displayed like an art installation in the forest. The officers called in county detectives, took it seriously as a stalking case. But they never found the people responsible. The camp was abandoned, no identification left behind. The investigation went nowhere. I never went back to that cabin. I can't work in remote locations anymore. I've developed severe anxiety about isolation, can't sleep without motion sensors, can't relax unless I'm in populated areas. I see therapists, take medication, try to function, but I'm fundamentally changed. The worst part is knowing they're still out there. Park rangers report finding abandoned camps monthly in Ohio Pile State Park, always with photographs of solo visitors pinned to trees, always watching, always documenting, never identified, never caught. One photograph was left on my car windshield before I drove away. I didn't notice it until I was miles from Ohio Pile. It showed me asleep in bed, photographed from directly above, from inside the cabin. The timestamp showed 2:13 a.m. on night 3, before I'd even known anything was wrong. They'd been inside while I slept, standing over my bed, photographing me. I'd been completely helpless, completely unaware, while something that looked almost but not quite human stood in my room and watched me sleep. I burn that image into my mind every time I start to feel safe. Every time I think maybe I'm overreacting, maybe it wasn't that bad, because it reminds me that for at least one night, probably more, I was completely at the mercy of something pretending to be human, something that watched with mechanical precision and perfect patience, something that's still out there in Pennsylvania's forests, watching solo hikers and isolated cabins, collecting photographs, and waiting for opportunities I don't want to imagine. The police told me to move on, said I was safe now, but I know better. Because 2 weeks after I left Ohio Pile, I found a new photograph slipped under my apartment door in Pittsburgh. Me, walking to my car that morning, taken from across the street. Same mechanical composition, same surveillance quality. They know where I live now. They're still watching, still documenting, still waiting with that perfect inhuman patience. The silence doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels like being observed. Imagine being completely alone in the wilderness, only to realize you're being watched by something that moves and acts like no human should. Would you investigate those strange sounds outside your remote cabin, or trust your instincts and run? Drop your answer in the comments, because isolation isn't always as safe as it seems. That's all 8 stories from Pennsylvania's darkest corners, where small towns hide secrets too disturbing to forget. These aren't just tales. They're warnings from people who survived encounters that defy explanation. If these stories left you unsettled, smash that subscribe button and join the Black Fears community. We uncover true horror hiding in America's forgotten places every week. Hit the bell icon so you never miss when darkness comes calling. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, fear finds us all eventually.